You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 206 of the Common Descent Podcast. This episode, we're discussing vestigial structures.
A foundational and fascinating concept in evolutionary science.
Yeah, this is something that you deal with if you even dip your toes into biology.
Yeah, vestigial structures is just a very commonly used and recognized term.
Absolutely. So we will be discussing what it means to be vestigial. You know, we very famously discussed these useless body parts, but what does it mean to be a useless, or is that an accurate definition? We'll go through some examples, discuss how we identify these structures and determine what counts as vestigial, and then we will discuss the evolutionary process of that goes into something becoming vestigial. This is a super fun topic. It's just chock-a-block full of neat, weird examples. And we will be discussing it because it was requested. All our topics are requested. This one was requested by Jamie, Thylacine, Baseman, Ian, Echevarria, Nathan, and Taterboy.
Thanks, everybody, as always, for those requests. Hey, listeners, if you want to submit a request, there's a topic request form on the website now. You can find a link in the episode description.
Check that out. While you're down there, you may also notice that we have a link to our Patreon because we have a Patreon, and that's where all of our funding comes from. It lets us do all the cool stuff we do, make all the cool content for you all, and if you sign up on Patreon, you can get extra bonus goodies. That can be extra content from us, live streams.
Live streams. We got a bonus noise episode coming up soon, which includes bonus news.
And at certain levels, you can get your name shouted out. So we would like to welcome Hazel as one of our new patrons.
Welcome and thank you for your support. Enjoy the live streams and bonus noise.
Check out the description for that. There's also plenty of other ways you can get in contact and engage and get extra stuff from us and send stuff to us. We have a mailing address down there. We have our Discord, etc., etc. So check out all that good stuff. Some quick announcements. We are coming up on the end of the year, which means the end of the year Q&A is right around the corner.
Wait, it's going to be so long.
We are eager to see all the questions that were asked.
The submission form is closed as of this episode, but check it out. Right at the end of the year, we'll release the big anthology of us answering questions from our audience. Hey, you know what else happens in December? The last episode of Spotlight 2024.
Yeah, we've wrapped up the year now.
We did the whole 10 episodes in total. All of them are now available on the podcast, on our YouTube. At the beginning of this month, we released our final episode with Callie, Gabriel, and Blake from Eons.
It was so much fun.
Super fun. Super happy to have them join us for the last episode of the series. Listeners, thank you to everybody who has enjoyed that series, who has listened, who has given us some feedback. If you liked it, be sure to tell us that you liked it. Maybe we will have more like that in the future.
Absolutely. Also, at the end of the year, we are coming up on our 8-year anniversary.
Yeah, end of January, 8 years of Common Descent.
There will be a live stream. There will be more announcements to come, so stay tuned for that.
We got some fun stuff planned for 2025.
Gonna be good. But now, our first section of the episode, the news. Every episode, we like to delve into some recent science news, paleontological, earth science, evolutionary, just to keep us all up to date on what's happening in the research world. David, what's new?
Giant worm lizard.
Cool.
Yeah, that's a good one. We're starting strong with squamates.
It's our Gorgon.
This is, it kind of is our Gorgon. This is research in the Zoological Journal of the Linnaean Society by Georgios Georgalis et al. And in the blog post after this episode, we will put a link to a press release in phys.org via the Senckenberg Research Institute and Natural History Museum. Worm lizards is the common name ascribed to a group of lizards called amphisbaenians. Amphisbaenians are a group of lizards that tend to be worm-shaped. They tend to be very small. They are long. They are mostly legless. They are burrowers, or they hang out in the leaf litter and stuff.
A lot of them are even pink.
A lot of them are, yeah, a lot of them are pink or barely pigmented.
Very wormy.
Very worm-like, very similar to a lot of other small legless lizards. Today, amphisbaenians are found all around the world, but mostly in Africa and South America. Their fossil record is also all over the world, mainly in Europe and North America, from the last 60 million years or so. This paper describes a new fossil species of worm lizard from Africa that is the largest known amphisbaenian.
Ooh.
This comes from a site in Tunisia called Chambi, dating to the Eocene around 50 million years ago. This site has lots of fossils of all sorts of different animals, including reptiles and amphibians, but according to the paper, there hasn't been much research on the reptiles and amphibians so far. Here, they partially rectify that oversight with the description of the new genus and species Pterosaur marcellosanchezi, an Eocene worm lizard. The fossils of this new species include jawbones, upper and lower jawbones, of several individuals.
Nice.
So there are multiple dentaries, multiple premaxillae, including lots of teeth. So we've got a partial look at the skull. Also, there are a bunch of vertebrae identified that are likely the same species based on their analysis. Based on the features of the skull, my notes here say feathers of the skull, which is absolutely not what that's supposed to say. There are no feathers on this lizard. The features of the skull suggest that it is closely related to modern worm lizards in a group called Trogonophidae, which includes such species as checkerboard worm lizards, which are named that because they have this sort of checkered black and white pattern on them.
Pretty.
They live today in Africa and the Middle East. This discovery is exciting because this is, according to the authors, only the 5th named fossil amphisbaenian from Africa, and one of a very short list of fossil trogonophids of this particular family.
Okay.
One of the things that is notable about Pterosaur, besides its size, which we'll get to in a second, is what they described as extreme dental anatomy. It's got wild teeth. The teeth have very thick enamel, the coating of the teeth. The cheek teeth, the teeth further back in the mouth, are round and blunt.
Oh.
And on each premaxilla, so that's the front part of the upper jaw, each premaxilla has one extra large blunt tooth.
Oh.
It's like this big, kind of bucktooth looking up in the front. They note that some of these features are shared with modern trogonophid worm lizards, which are snail eaters.
That's what I was guessing.
These are, episode 197, these are adaptations for durophagy, for eating hard foodstuffs.
And for things that are often burrowing, snails make perfect sense.
Yes.
As a go-to prey item.
They also compared the shape of the jawbones and their inference of what the musculature would have been like between this fossil species and modern species, and estimated that the fossil species would have had a very high bite force for its size, which they suggested likely means that it was able to eat a variety of snails.
Yeah.
So it could have gone after snails of different sizes, snails of different shell types. And then, of course, it's enormous for a worm lizard. Based on the pieces of the skull that they have, they estimate the full skull length to have been just over 5 centimeters.
Oh.
Which, compared to the largest amphisbaenians today, which have a skull that is only 3 centimeters. So, huge.
Yeah, like a notable size up.
For an amphisbaenian.
Yes.
Gigantic. They note that it's tricky to determine the total body length because they don't have all the vertebrae, and the number of vertebrae varies across lizards in general, but also within worm lizards.
I assumed that would be the case with worm lizards. They just seemed like one of the groups that would do that with
like
backbones.
snakes. Like I'm pretty sure legless lizards are all like that in general. The largest modern worm lizards are around 80 centimeters long, which that's almost 3 feet.
Yeah, that's
which
not
is
nothing.
quite large for a worm lizard. Based on the fossils they have here, depending on how many vertebrae this species had, they estimate that its full body length would have been likely between just under 80 centimeters, so around that same length, to just over 90 centimeters.
Yeah, gotcha.
So almost a full meter of worm lizard.
That's not bad.
With that potential body length, and particularly with the skull, this appears to be, if not the longest amphisbaenian ever, the largest known amphisbaenian.
Very cool.
Also, your point, you mentioned that for burrowers, that sort of diet makes sense. They actually talk in the paper about how, while most modern amphisbaenians are burrowers, they suspect this one probably wasn't a burrower.
Interesting.
Or if it was less so.
Yeah.
And they noted that based on its size, the largest modern amphisbaenians spend more time at the surface, but also the shape of its jaw muscles and sort of the inferred way that it would have been feeding would make more sense on the surface.
Interesting.
So this was a giant surface-dwelling amphisbaenian, which is a fun inverse of the way that we often like sci-fi fantasy things, where like the giant monstrous one is in the deep.
Yes,
and
exactly.
you have to be. This is like, yeah, if you're an amphisbaenian, don't go to the surface. Watch out, because there's meter-long amphisbaenians up there, and they're gonna steal your sails. I guess they're not gonna eat you.
Very cool, man. I so am curious. Just because because so many worm lizards, it's one of those where you'd have difficulty handling them just because we are so big and would so easily hurt them.
Yeah, the average worm lizards are like a few centimeters, maybe several like they tend to be very small.
Yeah, so the idea of one that like I could potentially have brought out, like I brought out snakes to do
you could
creature encounters.
Drape it over your shoulders.
Yeah. I want to know, like, would you have had the muscles for that, or would you still have been very difficult to pick up?
Yeah.
You know, like...
I've never handled a worm lizard in real life.
Now I want to know how snake or unsnake-like is... Because you're now up into... Like, there's also very tiny snakes, but...
Sure.
You're into
now you're the size of a corn snake.
Yeah, a normal snake size, a very average snake size. That's interesting. How do you function?
Were they thick bodied?
Yeah.
Like with your giant head and powerful jaws, were they like bulky worm lizards?
Exactly. Very cool.
Yeah. I love it when a fossil lizard makes actual headlines.
Yes.
That happens so rarely.
No.
Crocs get in the headlines all the time because people get excited or whatever. But like a cool fossil lizard, that rarely ever makes the headlines.
And well deserved. Well, my first news is about bird leg bones and how they relate to bird mobility and theropod evolution.
Ooh, this has been a trend in recent episodes we've recorded, is talking about bird legs.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about on those bird legs. They're not just delicious.
It's the time of the year.
This is research by Armida Manafsada et al. In Nature, and the article is a press release by Yale University and phys.org. So, specifically, the part of the bird leg they're looking at is within the drumstick. Mm-hmm. You know, so if you've eaten a drumstick before, you will actually be familiar with some of the anatomy. Inside there, that is what would be our shin, and which seems like, you know, it looks like it's big, but the thigh is actually above that.
Yes.
And so in our shin, there are two bones, the tibia and the fibula. And in us, they are both fairly decently sized bones. Mm-hmm. The tibia is the more robust, but both of ours are big bones.
Yeah, the fibula is still fairly substantial in our legs.
In birds, the fibula has greatly reduced. Mm-hmm. So the tibia is the handle on a drumstick. That is the bone in the drumstick. If you were to eat a drumstick, you will also notice that there is another bone that's kind of like a toothpick.
Yep.
Because it does not have another end. It has shortened, it has thinned. That is the remains of the fibula.
You might call it vestigial.
Yes. And for a long time, it was considered that that was just a result of the evolution of theropod legs and into bird legs, and that it was just kind of and that happened to the fibula, It's not...
Right. We see kind of similar adaptations in some of the limb bones of hoofed mammals.
Yes, absolutely. So it hadn't been looked at for whether it played an important role in its new shape. This study was wanting to look at, is there a purpose to this reduced fibula? Or is it just the result of it being reduced over time? They used X-ray videos of present modern birds, specifically the helmeted guinea fowl, to precisely measure the knee joint poses as the bird moves, to get a look at how it matches up with the femur above it.
Yeah, the knee is the top of the drumstick.
Yes, exactly. So they're wanting to see how it affects the joint between these bones. They then used animation software to combine the videos into 3D models of the knee joint and visualize how the surfaces of the tibia and the femur meet up with that remaining fibula in place. They also collected X-ray videos of iguana and alligator to compare to other reptile knee joints, as well as looked at the shapes of leg bones in other birds, including penguins, ostrich, owl, and crane. So they got a look at wide bird knees and saw some knees in motion and found that in birds, the tibial joint surfaces have a curved arch to them, and the shortened fibula is able to roll within the drumstick. It's very mobile inside the meat. So it's able to kind of rotate around the tibia, along, still staying in position, but along the surface of the tibia. And these features evidently enable the knee joints to maintain a smooth contact across a very wide degree of movements.
So the fibula is kind of like a little extension off the tibia. So at varying angles, it maintains contact with the femur above it.
It's able to adjust to these various knee angles up to 100 degrees.
Wow.
So major extension.
It basically expands the area available to contact the upper part of the leg.
That's what it seems like.
Very cool.
They call this extreme knee long axis rotation, or LAR. And extreme LAR is fundamental to the way birds move around. So this special movement, it allows them to twist and turn while walking on the ground and be very mobile while walking. They know that based on their observations, bird knees are moving in a way completely different from other reptiles. This is what allows them to kind of spin on the knee and rotate the knee effectively, which is probably also critical for things like prey capture and moving around other environments. They haven't looked into, I think, how it fits into those yet, but highly suspect that they will see some interesting things.
Yeah, that it might vary depending on, a swimming bird versus a running bird versus what kind of food they're going after.
Yes. This is interesting because in theropod dinosaurs, the predecessors to birds, there is actually a trend in stiffening up the knee joint, in making it a much more just hinge joint. And then certain ancestors to the avian lineage started showing this more curved joint.
Interesting. So this isn't just a dinosaur thing. This is a bird thing.
Is, the lineage that led to birds. It seems to be very significant to them. But that process of stiffening up the joint was likely part of what thinned and reduced the fibula, which then allowed it to be freed up for this new movement type. So one evolutionary process probably led to a situation that allowed for this new knee joint to evolve.
Yes. Keep that in mind later in the episode.
Yes. So that little bit of bone in the drumstick is actually really important to the bird.
Very cool. It's very fun. We talk so much about how many bird features are actually just dinosaur features that birds have because they're dinosaurs. It's fun to identify specific features. It's like, no, this actually is something that birds did.
Yeah.
Uniquely to them.
That they're doing different.
I would be very interested to see how this varies across different modern birds.
Absolutely. And I would love if they could do more of the X-ray video during different behavior. Like,
a
bird of prey pouncing, I don't know what the word for a bird of prey, striking down, pouncing.
Oh, sure. Lunging.
Dive bombing.
Yeah.
Landing on prey and grabbing prey. Are those knee joints being utilized during that struggle or grasping of the prey?
Yeah.
That'd be very cool.
Very interesting. Well, while we're on the note of dinosaurs, I've got a bit of news about dinosaur poop. Not just any dinosaur poop, lots of dinosaur poop. An evolutionary path of dinosaur poop.
That's a lot of poop.
It's a one big pile of poop. This is research in Nature by Martin Kvarnström, and we will link to an article on CNN by Katie Hunt. Dinosaurs first show up in the middle part-ish of the Triassic period, as we have discussed many times before. But dinosaurs don't become hyper-successful all over the world, the biggest things in their ecosystems, until the early part of the Jurassic. So there's this period of like 30 million years or so between dinosaurs showing up and dinosaurs showing up. Really, really taking off. What allowed them to finally gain those footholds has been the subject of many discussions. It's possible that they were able to outcompete other organisms in the ecosystem. Something shifted that they were just better equipped for. Or it might be that something went wrong with other animals in their ecosystems and dinosaurs got lucky and were able to fill in those spaces. The Triassic ends in a mass extinction event, episode 15, which has been pointed at as this is very likely a space where dinosaurs got lucky and were able to fill in spaces. Most of the research into this period of the rise of the dinosaurs has focused on skeletal remains. This paper attempts to examine that same time period looking at gut remains. They examine more than 500 specimens of bromelites. Bromelites include all sorts of gut things, including coprolites, which are fossil poop, cololites, which are fossil poop that hadn't left the body yet, gut contents, and regurgitolites, which is the opposite of fossil poop.
Yes.
That is, came out the front. In addition to feeding traces.
Okay, gotcha.
Bite marks and stuff like that. So just a ton of data on what were animals eating.
Yes.
These fossils came from 10 sites across the southern part of Poland, ranging from the mid-Triassic to the Jurassic, the early part of the Jurassic, this time of the rise of dinosaurs. The article notes that these fossils were collected over the course of 25 years.
Wow.
And I think they said that the study itself took 10 years.
Cool.
This is a big study.
That's I'm always impressed by that just due to the difficulties that I'm sure are
just
come
the
up.
Perseverance.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Listen,
well
you gotta, these people know their poop. Based on the size, the gut contents, and what other fossils are nearby, they were able to identify generally which things belong to which groups of animals, and then were able to identify, get a sense of the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. What was eating what in these ecosystems. Comparing that with climate data and plant information and other fossils, they put this dietary information sort of superimposed over all the other data we have to chart the rise of the dinosaurs as told by stuff that they ate.
Cool.
And they found interesting trajectories in these. They noted that over time, generally, the dinosaur bromelites increased in both size and diversity.
Makes sense.
They were getting bigger, they were eating more variety. They also identified 5 phases of change over the course of this time period, which they enumerated very helpfully. First, in the mid to late Triassic, we see omnivorous dinosaur precursors, right? The things that gave rise to the dinosaurs start to fill in parts of the ecosystem as non-dinosaurs are falling away.
Gotcha.
These early omnivores start to move in. Second, a little bit later, we see true dinosaur coprolites that include insects, fish. We see the rise of predatory dinosaurs, plus evidence of early omnivorous diets in them, so we're getting some diversifying. A little bit later than that, there is an expansion of herbivorous dinosaurs, dinosaurs whose guts have plants within them, which happens around the same time as certain climate and environmental changes that also changed what plants were around.
There you go.
So it seems the expansion of dinosaur herbivores, of plant eaters, coincided with a change in plant availability. This is also around the time we see predatory dinosaurs starting to increase in size and diversity, which makes sense. Toward the end of the Triassic, there is a drop-off of plant-eating therapsids, which are mammal relatives, and plant-eating pseudosuchians, which are the croc line, and a increase in early ornithischian plant-eating dinosaurs and sauropodomorph plant-eating dinosaurs.
Okay.
There is this changing of the guard, so to speak.
Yeah.
Big plant-eating dinosaurs are taking over where these other big plant-eaters once were. At this point, the authors note that there's also some interesting differences in what these groups were eating. The example that's listed in the article is that dicynodonts, which are therapsids, close relatives to early mammals, that were plant eaters, mostly seem to be eating conifers, whereas the dinosaur poops and such had a wider variety of plants. So it might be that dinosaurs were better able to utilize the diversity of plants, and that might have given them an edge. And then finally, around the end of the Triassic into the Jurassic period, the diversity of dinosaurs continues to expand, including early evidence of large theropods, large predatory dinosaurs. So overall, this trend is interesting because it shows that the rise of dinosaurs wasn't just one thing.
Yes.
It was multiple stages. It was a complex process that seems to have been somewhat related to environmental changes, somewhat related to what other organisms were coming and going at the time, but also somewhat related to dinosaurs having the capacity to take advantage of certain diets that other animals might not have had.
Cool.
This is super cool. It's such a cool a picture to get from the data. They do note that this is all from South Poland.
Yes.
It's like, this is what was happening in this one particular part of the world, but that this could very well be a glimpse of what was going on globally at this time.
Yeah, that there's no reason these patterns couldn't be similar across many ecosystems.
But let's go find a bunch of poops from other places.
Absolutely. Well, and it's so nice because this is such a cool way to add another overlay of data onto that very critical transition to a world that, we famously described as ruled by dinosaurs. Fossils can definitely tell us, but this also gives us an idea of how they were interacting with the ecosystem and how that was shifting during that time. That's very cool.
It really drives home the value of trace fossils.
Yes.
We talked about poops in episode 30. We talked about trace fossils in episode 118, that they can tell you things the fossils of the actual animals don't all the time. And in this case, the trace fossils are tracing changes in not just what was in the ecosystem, but how different organisms were interacting in these ecosystems.
It's
like how the food web was changing.
Yes,
this
exactly.
is tracking the food web.
And so often that can be such a hard thing to really get a grasp on. So it's very cool to get a glimpse of that here. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, my last news is also about a very important transition in a group. Okay. This one is pterosaurs.
All right, okay, I'm on board. I was about to make a joke about, there's no poop.
Yep.
But no, pterosaurs, I'm here for it.
This is research describing a new species of pterosaur that seems to have allowed us to fill in the remaining gaps between early and later pterosaur anatomy.
Ooh.
This research is by Dave Hone et al. In Current Biology, and the article is a press release from the Queen Mary University of London in SciTech Daily. So for quite a while, pterosaurs were split into two major groups: the early pterosaurs, the non-pterodactyloids, and the later large pterodactyloids.
Right. The early ones including things like Dimorphodon and Rhamphorhynchus, and then things like Pteranodon and Pterodactylus and Quetzalcoatlus in the later groups.
The early members tend to be smaller, like less than 2 meters, and the bigger ones being some of the ones that get up to 10-meter wingspans, giants.
We talked about this transition and this difference a bunch in episode 79 about pterosaurs. It was also a key part of our discussion in our spooky episode about wyverns.
Yes, it was. And the thing that distinguishes these groups is they are distinctly shaped different. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they both are flyers, they both have wings, but the early pterosaurs are noted by having shorter heads and shorter necks, short bones in the wrist of the wing, and long fifth toe on the foot, and long tails.
Right.
The pterodactyloids are the opposite in each of those. Large heads, long necks, a long wrist, a short fifth toe, and a short tail. But for a long, long time, we were kind of missing a lot of the transition between these two anatomical groups. In recent years, we have found some of the members that fill in the middle.
Yeah, I think isn't Darwinopterus one of those?
Absolutely. The Darwinopterans were found in like the 2010s that we started finding some of them, and they are an intermediate group and fall somewhere in the middle. They have head and neck more like the pterodactyloids, but bodies that were much more like the early pterosaurs. And that revealed that the head and neck changed first. That was the first thing that started to adjust to that later body plan. But there were still some major gaps on either side of the Darwinopterans. This new species, this is Scyphosaura bavarica. It is a new large Jurassic pterosaur. Its mean name Sword Tail from Bavaria because it was found in southern Germany, and it has a very short and stiff tail that was kind of pointed and sword-shaped.
Also like our wyverns.
Yeah. This might be it.
We're going to have to go back. We did it. We found it. We found the spooky wyverns.
This is a complete specimen with nearly every bone preserved. So extremely good. It's also 3D preserved. It's 3 dimensions, so it's not flattened like your typical pterosaur fossil is. It seemed to have about a 2-meter wingspan, so nothing ridiculous, but not
sizable,
not itty bitty. And it helps bridge between the Darwinopterans and later pterodactyloids. It has a very pterodactyloid-like head and neck, and shows a longer wrist and a shorter tail and toe than earlier Darwinopterans, but not as long in any of those as later pterodactyloids.
Lovely.
It's a very classic intermediate transitional specimen. They used this to do a new reconstruction of the family evolutionary tree of pterosaurs and confirmed Scyphosaura's intermediate position between the Darwinopterans and pterodactyloids. It also repositioned a Scottish pterosaur named Jark.
We talked about that one in the news not long ago.
Absolutely, which seems to fit a mirror position on the other side of the Darwinopterans between them and the early pterosaurs.
Oh.
So now with this new evolutionary analysis, this is one study, so it might be adjusted by others, but with this current results, we have a complete, basically uninterrupted line from early pterosaurs to later pterodactyloids.
Yeah, now we just have 4 more gaps.
Yes, exactly.
In between each of these points.
It's that scene from Futurama, the great big, like, aha, I have you now.
Yes, yep.
So now we have early pterosaurs, Jark, Darwinopterans, Scyphosaura, and then pterodactyloids. So we have a decent, full grasp of the transition. Not every specimen is complete. There are still going to be gaps, so there's still pieces to be filled in, but that long-standing missing gap, that missing data between these two endpoints of pterosaurs seems to have been fairly well filled in with this new specimen, with the help of this new specimen.
Yeah, very cool.
It shows that step-by-step transition in those features across the groups. They fit in to the transitional process that we would expect from the two ends. It also shows there's a clear increase in terrestrial competence, that they become better walkers.
Oh, sure.
As the group goes on.
Presumably the earlier ones were more climbing.
Yeah. And that's something we've mentioned before. We mentioned that on another one about them becoming walkers, and you can see it through these transitional groups become more and more a key characteristic. They also noted that both Scyphosaura and Jark are unusually big for the time periods and points they are at, which suggests that the changes that whatever they were that enabled large size evolved early on in some of these transitional groups.
Yeah, that they didn't need to achieve true pterodactyloid form in order to get big.
Exactly.
They started getting big before that transition happened.
Yes. So yeah, this is a major step in our understanding of the evolution of pterosaurs.
Yeah, now we have to find one from before the non-pterodactyloid pterosaurs.
Yes.
Between pterosaurs and whatever their ancestor was.
Please.
That will finally complete the whole picture. Right now we have a beautiful evolutionary sequence that's just floating somewhere on the Archosaur family tree.
Could we please tell us how you learned how to fly? We would really love to understand.
That's very cool.
It's neat.
Also, very delightful of Dave Hone et al. To discover our speculative wyvern.
Yeah, absolutely.
Apparently, which is great.
Scyphosaura wyverni.
Scyphosaur, that was the one. This was it. Go back to the spooky episode. This is the animal we were talking about.
With that,
its tail was reduced.
It was reduced.
Eventually, maybe vestigial.
I definitely picked both of these newses because they had about the reduction and shifting of features. Now we can discuss the topic of vestigiality and what it means for something to be vestigial. Stay tuned. I feel like vestigial structures are one of those interesting science concepts that falls into that nebulous area where they get referenced and brought up frequently, but not always explained what that actually means.
Yeah, I think vestigiality is a concept that is very widely understood.
Yes.
But we don't often actually stop to talk about what makes a vestigial structure, what counts, why are they here, all the sort of in-depth discussion. Vestigial structures often come up as a passing note.
Or a fun fact.
During some other discussion.
Yes. Like, we'll say, did you know that the human appendix doesn't have a purpose? But then we don't always explain, okay, but why is that? That's weird.
Yes. So this episode is this discussion.
Vestigial structures, a core concept in biology and evolutionary sciences. Basically, it is the idea that certain body parts or parts of the anatomy have lost their purpose, their biological purpose. Whatever function they were serving, they no longer serve it, but they're still present in the organism's anatomy. There are also other terms that will get used similarly to this. Vestigial structure is the most common proper term, but you'll also see vestigial organs used quite frequently.
Sure.
But even though not all examples are organs, but the classic ones that get brought up in especially us humans often fall in that category. Sometimes they're just called vestiges, rudimentary structures, remnants, vestigiality. So sometimes just degenerate or atrophied. That
sure.
Because very often vestigial structures are reduced.
Yes, and we've said the word reduced in referring to physical features on animals' bodies a million times on this podcast.
Yes. The kind of, boiling them all down from the various wordings, the kind of definition of a vestigial structure is a non-functional feature that is functional or fully functional in a related group.
Mm-hmm.
So a structure that in us doesn't serve a purpose, but in our cousins, like the other great apes, does serve a purpose.
And by extension, our ancestors.
Yes.
This is a structure that used to, in our lineage, have a function that it no longer has.
Yes, that in us, we lost it for some reason, but the structure has stuck around. The degree to which that functionality is lost varies depending on interpretation, and we'll talk more about that. Sometimes you'll see it listed as non-functional structure. Sometimes it's a structure that has lost a function.
Yes. Not fully functionless, but this particular thing is no longer part of it.
Very often, and once again, we'll get into more detail on this when we talk about how you identify it. Very often, the thing that is focused on is that it lost its main function.
Sure.
The crucial job of this structure is no longer what it's doing. It might be doing stuff, but it's not doing the thing that we considered it was, quote unquote, evolved for, that it was around for originally. This is also one of those terms that has a common usage, that we use the word vestigial often when we're describing things in human society.
Sure.
And vestiges is a term that we use. And sometimes that they are used in very similar ways, but sometimes that can also confuse the terms. For biology, it focuses on some sort of anatomical structure had a purpose that it no longer exhibits and is still present in spite of seemingly not doing the job it's there to do. This is not a recent concept.
No.
People have been noticing that animals, particularly originally, have body parts that aren't doing jobs for centuries. And in fact, millennia. There are accounts from Aristotle.
Sure. Seems like something he would adjust.
Noting that moles' eyes are not doing the job of eyes because moles are blind. At least many moles are blind.
They still have eyes even though they are apparently not using them to see.
There's evidently a quote of him calling them stunted in development. There's also numerous scientists and academics that made note of it in their works, looking in as the concept of evolution was coming into shape. Erasmus Darwin in 1791 recognized vestigial structures as evidence of biological evolution. I found quotes from Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire in 1798, who is quoted, and I like some of the wordings that they used, that they noted rudiments that have not been eliminated because nature never works in rapid jumps. If an organ plays an important role in other species of the same family, nature always leaves vestiges of an organ, even though it is completely superfluous. I reorganize it a little bit to flow better with what we're saying.
Sure. Fascinatingly, this is a half century before Darwin publishes his grand theory.
So people have been noticing there's things left behind. Lamarck, famous Lamarck.
Jean-Baptiste.
1809 in Philosophie Zoologique, named numerous vestigial structures and noted them down in his writings. And then Charles Darwin talks about these structures famously, both in Descent of Man and in Origin of Species.
Yeah, vestigial structures are a major theme throughout Origin.
Yes. And in Descent of Man, he lists a whole bunch of specific human ones and how it relates to our ancestry. The muscles of our ear, no longer being able to move the ear. Wisdom teeth, our appendix. Tailbone, body hair. It's also noteworthy that Darwin also hit upon the idea that vestigial structures do not necessarily have to have no purpose.
Right.
But just lack a purpose.
Yeah, this was Darwin. So Origin of Species, as we've talked about before, was Darwin's great thesis of here is why I think evolution is a thing that happens.
Yes.
And vestigial structures are an incredibly important part of that evidence. And it makes perfect sense that he would have put into words that it doesn't need to be functionless to be vestigial, because what determines its vestigiality isn't what it does now, but the comparison between what it does now and what it did ancestrally.
Yes, exactly. There was a quote of, an organ serving for two purposes may become rudimentary or utterly aborted for one, even the more important purpose, and remain perfectly efficient for the other.
Yes.
It was also noted that in a section that was, at least for a time, called Effects of Use and Disuse, he noted that use of a body part strengthens and enlarges it, and disuse reduces it.
Sure. That is the more common way that we use the term atrophy.
Yes, exactly.
Right? If you are in the hospital for a month for some reason and you haven't walked the whole time, you have to exercise your leg muscles again because the muscles will start to atrophy.
And he noted that in evolution, there's a similar that a body part doing a task stays prominent and large, while the non-functional body part tends to become reduced in size and less defined often. They can become very misshapen because they're no longer crucial to doing a job. And in 1893, Robert Wiedersheim published The Structure of Man, going through human anatomy and looking at our evolutionary history. In the first draft, I believe it was, there was a list of 86 human organs described as having become wholly or in part functionless, some of them appearing in the embryo alone, others present throughout life, and quoted organs which may rightly be termed vestigial. Mm-hmm. Later versions increased the list up to 180 vestigial organs, which got quoted in the Scopes trial.
Oh, interesting.
In 1925, where they were defending the concept of evolution being taught.
Yep, right here in Tennessee.
They quoted that, according to Wiedersheim, there are no less than 180 vestigial structures in the human body, sufficient to make a man a veritable walking museum of antiquities.
Oh, that's very cool.
I had to include that quote. And that's where we got the term vestigial to be used for these things. Because different people used, Lamarck called them rudiments and vestiges. Darwin used rudimentary organs. Mm-hmm. It was Wiedersheim that really called them vestigial structures and vestigial organs. And we've taken that term since then. As that walk through history displays, this concept has been crucial to our understanding and shaping of our view of the history of life and evolution as a concept. As you noted, when we find two structures in two related groups, one of which that has decreased and one of which is still functional, not only does it give us an idea of what that structure used to do, but also that you two share a common ancestor. Mm-hmm. Even though you're not able to do all the same things because one of you has gone vestigial with some part, you still have a remnant of that shared history. This means that vestigial structures, though kind of a odd, and seeming conundrum, are extremely useful as evidence of the path of evolution. They're trace marks of the ancestry of that organism.
Yeah, if you like Google evidence for evolution, you're going to get like a top 5 and one of them is going to be vestigial.
Exactly.
Structures.
They're also super useful in like tracking evolution and loss of traits. If we can look at various members of a lineage and say, yeah, you can see more vestigial, less vestigial, in between vestigial versions of this structure, so we can track the pattern of how this trait has changed and been lost or been adjusted in this group over time. I found one, I think it was on the wiki article, where they mentioned a quote from Douglas Futoyma, who's an evolutionary biologist here in America, that stated that vestigial structures make no sense without evolution.
Right.
So it's one of those where to actually make sense of these, you need evolution as a concept. So of course they became crucial in not only fostering that idea in us, but helping us make sense of it. He compared it to, you can't truly understand the English language through just spelling unless you also understand the Anglo-Saxon and Norse origins of the words. Because it won't make sense why words are spelled that way unless you understand the word they used to be.
Yes.
Now, while all of that is well and good and exciting, it is also important to note that vestigial structures can often be very difficult to identify.
Yes.
Or at least agree upon.
Yes. I can't count the number of times that I've seen headlines in my life that say, this organ actually isn't vestigial, as it turns out.
Yes.
Says new study.
Part of this is because there's a little bit of ambiguity to the definition inherently. Mm-hmm. What does a function mean? What does function loss mean? And if we are also saying that it doesn't have to be completely functionless, which is also difficult to nail down, how do we determine which function is the main function and whether or not it's been lost?
It's a word with an imprecise definition.
Yeah, that is a qualitative description of a body part, not one we can just set a standard measurement to. It's a situation by situation concept. Very often, authors and papers studying vestigiality will set out what their rules and what they deem to be the acceptable range or conditions. I found one paper that listed out their 3 criterion for something to be identified as vestigial. The first was that the structure exhibits extreme reduction in comparison to sister groups. Mm-hmm. So it is reduced. I think they might have given a measurement of like 1/3 or something like, but like,
interesting.
It's kind of like a what counts as megafauna. Mm-hmm. What you think is reduced enough to be extremely reduced might be different between me and David.
Right. But reduced.
Reduced. Second criterion, the structure has lost specialized morphology that it exhibits in a sister group. So the example they used is if we were looking at a finger bone for like the tip of our finger in a group that has a claw, that distal phalange is shaped like a claw to then be covered by a claw nail. In a vestigial version of that, it will have lost that distinct shape because it's no longer serving that. So it might be
not only smaller, but less specialized.
Yeah. So it might be pebble shaped or just kind of generally roundish. Mm-hmm. And then the third is the structure has lost as they put it, salient ancestral function, that it has lost some job it did in an ancestor.
That pebble finger no longer is functional as a claw.
Yes.
You can't scratch with it.
Some will specify that it only counts if it's a major function.
Okay.
That if the claw was also good at digging, but it was mostly for prey capture and it lost the digging ability, that's not a vestigial claw.
Right.
It has to no longer be able to be a claw. And once again, what's a major function mean?
Right.
But that's a situation that you would have to describe each time. The example they gave, which I thought was interesting just because I'd never thought of this, was a pelvis that has become disconnected from the spinal column and can no longer propel the body forward with the back limbs because it's not attached to the rest of the body.
Yes.
It has lost one of the major functions of our pelvis, which is to propel our body forward in us walking animals.
Right. Which I believe is the condition of the pelvis in whales.
Yes, indeed. Typically, and most agree that for it to be vestigial does not mean it has no function, just that it's lost some major function, so it could still have others. There have been interpretations, and I'm sure maybe potentially still are, not going to speak for all the vestigial analysis and researchers out there, that consider that it has to be fully functionless to be a vestigial structure. It is doing no job in the body that we can identify, but most don't use that strict definition. We see this in lots of classic vestigial structures, like the second and fourth metacarpals, which are the hand and wrist bones in horses that no longer carry toes because they only have the one toe, are these straps of bone along the leg that are classic examples of vestigial structures, but they still act as connection points for ligaments, muscle attachment, and supports for the bones around them. So they're still useful.
Right. They're not supporting fingers anymore.
Yeah, they're not doing the job that we think is the main job of those bones.
Which is the job that those bones do in basically every other species.
Yes, exactly. Talking about the whale pelvis, that's another one where it still is anchored to muscles for the reproductive organs. Mm-hmm. So it's still important for parts of their anatomy, just not the original and more crucial, arguably, parts that we think of. But this can make it difficult to determine, is the job it's doing reduced enough to be considered vestigial? If it's still doing a job, does that really mean it's lost a role, or has its role just shifted? It's kind of a vague concept when you get into these, especially weird scenarios where it's doing a very different thing than it used to. So there can be a lot of debate as to whether or not we should refer to it that way, or if the terms term is actually... It's kind of like the conversation we had about living fossils, where
Sure.
this can be a useful descriptor to describe groups that have not changed very much, but when it's actually useful and when it's misleading is disagreed upon.
Right. Well, and it's important to note that often when, the headline comes out and they go, a study shows that the appendix still has a function, that usually doesn't negate the vestigiality of it.
Yes.
Usually it's like, it turns out the appendix is doing this weird thing that we didn't realize it was doing. It's still not doing all the other things that we knew it wasn't doing.
Yes.
That led to us calling it a vestigial structure. It now has some sort of ancillary function that we weren't aware of, but it's still vestigial in the context that we've been calling it vestigial.
And that often is probably that confusion between how strict the term is.
Right.
That for many people, and often when it's used just colloquially or the fun facts are shared, the idea is this is a body part that might as well not be here, but is for some reason.
Right. And in real life, it's not quite as black and white as that.
There are examples that very much seem to be that way, and there are many examples that are a nuanced gray area of how important that structure still is or isn't. It's also really important to confirm that it's not just a weird individual.
Yes.
That you didn't just find someone with an atrophied organ that, through development or mutations, has an interesting situation that's unique to this individual. So you need to determine it is a situation for the species. It's also good to do that because you need to determine what the variation is for this structure, because since these are no longer doing jobs, they can be incredibly variable. Way more variable than the ancestral functioning situation for that structure typically is. I also found one paper that was specifically looking at vestigial structures in the skeletal structures of mammals, non-cranial examples, and they were focusing on using phylogenetics to try to confirm their vestigial structures. So, are you two indeed related based on phylogenetics? Therefore, are the two situations for this a functioning and non-functioning version? And this actually led to them finding a bunch of mammal groups that they couldn't find any examples of vestigial structures in.
Interesting.
This included monotremes, most marsupials, and then aardvarks, elephants, pangolins, shrews, moles, hedgehogs, and tree shrews, which most likely is due to the fact that these are very reduced groups now. So we don't have as much to compare them to see, because you can only see that something's vestigial by comparing it to a functioning version.
Right. And I'm sure if some other team of scientists did this same sort of analysis with their varied definitions of what they're looking for, they would end up with a slightly different list.
Yes. So it can actually be kind of difficult to solidly identify a vestigial structure. I think one of the best demonstrations of that is I couldn't find a example of we think this is vestigial in this fossil organism. I couldn't find it. I tried. None of the papers I went through mentioned it, and I couldn't find anything saying, yeah, we think this is a vestigial structure in this fossil organism, which then made me have the idea of, can we identify it in a fossil organism? Because we can't confirm or deny its functionality.
Yep.
Since that animal's dead and we're missing all the other biological context. There's definitely situations I've heard of cited as this might have been vestigial, because it sure does seem, we can't think of how this would still be doing a job.
Sure.
But it's also a distantly extinct dinosaur which had very strange anatomy that we do not fully understand, so maybe this was the normal condition for this bone.
Yeah. Usually when vestigial structures are described in fossils, it's a structure that is known in related groups to be vestigial.
Exactly.
Like if we find a fossil of a whale from 30 million years ago and we see those back legs, we can say, all right, that's a vestigial structure. We see the same thing in modern whales and it's vestigial. I've seen reports of the vestigial structures in things as old as the Paleozoic, which will be like, oh, this piece of an arthropod, this antenna or something that is reduced in the same way that we see in modern relatives of this, where it's non-functional.
Yes. But most often fossils comes into this conversation as the ancestral example.
Yes.
And now we can see, like, this group used to have big teeth.
Yes, used to have complete legs.
They have no teeth. That fossil is what told us that that used to be a more prominent functional feature. So it's an interesting scenario.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, there are still tons of examples that are very well supported and studied. It is not all nebulous, but it can often be, the minutia can get very debatable depending on how you're looking at it. As is so often the case, the list of types of vestigial structures is arguably infinite.
Yes.
Like,
new ones keep showing up every day.
I was going to say, there's so many that we know of, and for sure so many we don't know of. There's each organism is a list of vestigial structures in and of themselves. There are plenty of big famous ones that come up. To run through some quick categories and fun examples, very often the go-to examples for vestigial structures are physical anatomical features. That's why vestigial organs is such a common term. Things like the human appendix, which we think in ancestral mammals, in our ancestors that were more a plant-based diet, would have housed bacteria to help break down plants. Now we can't tell that it does anything for digestion. It might have some jobs, but we're not sure and this is why when it becomes inflamed, the go-to response is get rid of it.
Yeah, it's not doing anything anyway.
Because you're not worse or better with or without it.
Which is one of the ways that you determine that something's a vestigial structure.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if we took it out of you and you did fine.
And you didn't notice.
Yes, all right, that seems vestigial to me.
Our tailbone's a classic one. Still important for certain things. It has a lot of muscle attachment to it. Our gluteus maximus is attached there.
The tuchus.
That's important.
But it's not a tail.
But it's not a tail.
And it doesn't do any of the things that a tail does.
Exit our body wall anymore. So it is a vestigial tail. You'll also see interesting patterns in how vestigial structures are expressed. One that I found that was interesting is hind limbs in whales. They do not have back legs, but they often still have vestigial structures. They still have parts of the hips in the body. And in embryos, hind limb buds do appear. But in the odontocetes, which are your toothed whales, they regress and aren't formed.
Right. They reverse, basically.
Yes, they start to form, and then they change direction and stop forming. In the mysticetes, the filter-feeding whales, there are still vestigial hind limbs present in the body. Depending on which one you look at, depends on how much of the leg bones, but you can get different ways that in an adult toothed whale, you wouldn't know that it had vestigial legs. But in an embryo, they do have vestigial legs for a little bit.
Yes. And then compare that to something like modern boas and pythons,
yes,
which not only still have vestigial remnants of their hind legs, they actually do protrude outside of the body as those little claws.
And then my new favorite example of this, which I think you're going to love, there's a genus of Southeast Asian skinks, many of which have reduced limbs, some which are limbless. One specific species that is very snake-like, the adults have no signs of limbs, minus a scale where where you would expect the limbs to be that have kind of a little indent in it. So it's where the bud should be, but isn't. In embryos, while they're developing, they have shortened but well-developed limbs.
Huh.
During development, the limbs stay small, but the pectoral girdle, which is what makes up our shoulders, grows in proportion with the body. So their shoulder bones are growing normally, quote unquote, but the limbs are staying small. And by later stages of development, the small limbs are still present, but now under the skin. So in the adults, under that scale, there are developed limbs, just tiny ones.
Little baby legs.
Yes.
Huh. So this is a fascinating, and this is something that will come up later on, is that there are different patterns on how similar structures become vestigial.
Yes.
Like vestigial in one group of animals might mean you only have one bone of the limbs that remains from the ancestral condition. In those, it's the whole leg is there. It just stopped developing at, 2 weeks or whatever.
Yep.
And then the rest of the body kept growing.
And this is not how other legless lizards do it.
Yes.
If you CT scanned other legless lizards, you don't find little hidden limbs.
No, and that's not the case with snakes.
Yes.
It's the bones themselves are reduced in size and number.
Yeah, this is my new favorite. That's so weird, and I love it. Pocket limbs. But it's not always physical structures. There are also other versions and examples of vestigiality. Behaviors can be vestigial. Mm-hmm. We can see that an organism exhibiting a behavior that used to be critical for its survival or useful for its survival, but doesn't apply to its current situation.
Yeah.
And yet they are still displaying that behavior.
This is, vestigial behaviors are even harder to identify for sure than vestigial physical features.
Yeah, especially because
there's a lot of debate and discussion around how do we actually determine that a behavior is vestigial.
Because there's a bunch of situations where the proposed ancestral reason for that behavior can make a lot of sense on the surface, but just because an answer makes sense doesn't mean it's the answer.
Right.
One of the ones that I found, which is a fun one, but it very much falls in the category of, or it could be maybe a dozen other things, is dogs' instinct to circle before lying down has been proposed that it's to tamp down grass.
Yeah, that they do, that they walk in a circle, 2 or 3 times and then lay down.
Is when you're living in a grassy area, you want to tamp down your substrate to make a bed area to lie down. So that circle is useful. It is a practical behavior. Now it's just cute. But also, we don't know that that's what it used to do. It's just that is a hypothesized one. One that comes up with us very often is babies' grips. Mm-hmm. Babies have that instinct to grab onto fingers and things placed in their hand.
Yes, this is the classic. You've seen this in movies and stuff a bunch where a brand new newborn baby reaches up. Usually it's like to the father.
Yes.
And it's the moment that the father goes, oh, a child.
I'm a dad.
I'm a dad now. This is bad.
Not Teddy, Daddy.
And grabs the finger.
Yes.
It's like, yeah, that is a instinctual thing babies do, is that if something gets into their hand, they will grab it.
Yes, it's called the palmar grasp reflex. Mm-hmm. And it's thought to be ancestral from primate ancestors, which baby primates, for many, many species, the babies cling to their parents.
Yes.
From a very early age.
They have to be able to grab to survive.
Yes, because that's how the parents don't cradle them in their arms like we do, because they walk on all fours for most species.
Or they're climbing.
Or yeah. So the babies have to cling to the chest or back of their parent, and you'd have to be able to hold on from basically day one.
Yes.
So having a gripping instinct is crucial. We are too weak now as babies to do that, to actually hold on to someone, but we still have that gripping reflex.
Yes. Also, actually, I just realized that the other example of that scene is in Hercules.
Yes.
And he grabs him and he lifts him up.
Yes. Hercules would do great.
Hercules would be great.
Yes.
He'd be able to hold on.
You put him on anything, he's like a magnet.
He's strong.
He's
like
just
his dad.
There's also lots of examples for previously anti-predator or like parasite behaviors. Famous examples, the American pronghorn, which is one of the fastest animals alive today and lives in a country where nothing moves even remotely as fast as they do.
Sure.
Has been seen as a probably holdover from when there were fast-moving predators in North America.
This is another one of those that this has been heavily debated.
Exactly.
It could be it could just be a travel function.
Absolutely.
That it helps them get from place to place more quickly. This is the inherent, it's so hard to know all of the functions of a behavior.
Yes, and to then agree on, well, is that the main function or the side function?
Yes, exactly.
Was migration the reason you did it and it was beneficial for predators, or were you running from predators and then realized you could get places? Some fun ones, you'll like this one. Californian ground squirrels evolved with snake predators, but have been living without them for a long time, yet still show a lot of behaviors that are interpreted as anti-snake defenses. Things like caution around sticks and things resembling snakes, substrate throwing, and evidently there's been studies that have found they can distinguish between different kinds of snakes, even though they don't live with those snakes.
Yeah, interesting.
So they still seem to have an instinctual hesitance around snakes, but they haven't needed it for apparently thousands of years.
Yeah, it is a vestigial instinct response to predators.
Yes. I also found one that I had never even thought about this. There are bighorn sheep populations that live in the desert, but still have tick grooming habits.
Oh, interesting.
But there are no ticks in the desert.
There's no ticks around?
Yeah. It's reduced. They don't groom as much as others of their cousins, but they do still groom for a parasite they no longer need to worry about. Similar things have been found in birds that have to fear for nest parasites. Village weaver birds, which were introduced to an African island of Hispaniola, still retain their habit of rejecting foreign eggs, even though there's no foreign eggs being laid in their nest. Mm-hmm. But they will do it if under tests, but they've lost the physical adaptation of distinct colored eggs, which would have helped them to identify. So they've lost the physical defense, but they've maintained the behavioral defense.
Yeah, so it is also a reduced feature.
Yes.
They're missing parts of it.
And that was noted in the paper that I read about all of these, that behavioral vestiges seem to lag longer than the physical vestiges. That after a physical feature has been lost, often the behavior will stick around a little bit longer.
Interesting.
I also found some interesting ones about like signaling. There were Hawaiian oceanic field crickets that the males click their wings to sing, but they're also parasitized by flies that listen for those calls. So there are many populations where the males have lost the ability to sing due to their wings changing shape, so that if they rub them, it makes no noise. Mm-hmm. But they still rub them.
Yes.
They still do the wing movement, even though it's useless. And there is an example of rattlesnakes on the island of Santa Catalina off the coast of California that have reduced rattles that no longer rattle, but they still rattle their tails.
Yep.
So,
and that's one that is very interesting to me.
Yep.
I disagree that that's a vestigial structure.
I thought you would.
Because I've heard that one proposed before, that, rattlesnakes shake their tails. These have lost or reduced their rattles, but they still shake the tail. But tail shaking is a very common feature among snakes. Shaking the tail is the ancestral condition that rattlesnakes then developed further. And so a rattlesnake that has lost its rattle and still shakes its tail is just doing what a normal snake does.
Yep.
Thus demonstrating again the complexity of where do we draw the line of what is vestigial.
And that came up with the behaviors a lot of, are you still doing this because you were doing it before you had the feature you lost? Mm-hmm. Or are you still doing it because it hasn't gone away yet?
Right.
And sometimes we can't know.
Yes.
Like, if we don't have evidence for these behaviors, we don't have fossil evidence of a lot of these, so we can't know whether you were doing it before you were shaped the way you were.
Yes.
And then lost that shape.
Now, what I would be actually very interested to see is if those rattlesnakes that have reduced their rattle... Because rattlesnakes have extra special adaptations in their tails to help them shake them extra efficiently and quickly.
Yes.
So if those rattleless rattlesnakes are still rattling, are still shaking their tails with that extra speed and efficiency, that would be vestigial.
Yes. That would be unnecessary.
That is unnecessary for what you need to do, which you have because it's a vestigial part of the behavior. But the whole behavior is not vestigial. And so here's where it starts to get complicated.
Another one of those that has that kind of yes, but was Goosebumps on Us.
Oh, yeah. This is another one I've heard brought up.
That, when we get cold or frightened, often are little muscles at the base of our hairs called erector pili muscles, amps, will contract, and it causes the hair to stand straight up.
Yes, that scene from Infinity War.
Yes,
where Spider-Man, the hairs on his arms stand up.
Absolutely, those are amps going off. And this, in most mammals, serves two purposes. In cold weather, it raises and poofs the fur to trap more air against the body and help insulate them from the cold. And in defense situations, when they are startled, it poofs the fur like a black cat raising its back on Halloween to make it look more imposing and big and scary, hopefully. In us, The fear response is fully useless.
You can't even see it most of the time.
No, it's not visual. It's not doing anything. That's a vestigial response. Arguably, though, the cold response is still responding the same way, just not with the same use because of our hair. So that, I've seen it argue that that's not vestigial because it is responding normally and that it can still help with our thermoregulation. It's just doing it differently. That's one of those where which part of it is considered vestigial, even though it's the same biological response. Another one I found that I have to share because this is my actual favorite from all the notes is flightless cormorants from the Galapagos have tiny wings, but are still good swimmers. They just swim with their feet. They tuck their wings in against the body, and they swim with their feet. Cormorants famously are swimming birds, but they often are flighted.
Yes,
so these are...
like ducks.
Yes. These are flightless cormorants. So their wings are vestigial structures. They don't use them to fly. They don't use them to swim. They are just still there. But when they come out of the water, cormorants classically have to go up onto a spot and sun their wings because they do not have waterproof feathers because it allows them to dive better.
Right.
These flightless cormorants also dry their wings off.
Even though it doesn't matter.
Even though it doesn't matter. So they have both. It's a vestigial structure with vestigial behaviors attached that they're still doing, even though seemingly there's no reason to have those wings nor to dry them off.
Very cool.
Yeah. There also are examples of vestigiality in genomes. Genes can be considered vestigial, but this is even more difficult
Yes.
to identify. It is very hard to, identify what a gene does, what a sequence of DNA does. That is a very, it takes a whole study often to determine what a single gene does. So determining that it doesn't do anything is actually quite a tall ask. Also, just because it's not expressed now doesn't mean that it's lost its expression.
Right. It might be active under only certain circumstances or at certain stages of life or something.
It also might have been quote unquote junk DNA without a function for who knows how,
right.
We don't, calling you vestigial might be redundant because you might have become vestigial back when we were a fish.
Right. Or it might have never had a function.
Yeah.
This might just be a weird little offshoot.
And if you didn't have a function, not having a function now,
then you can't be vestigial.
You did not lose a function, which is one of those weird gotcha, technicality things.
Technically, the legalese is no, this never had a function.
Yeah, you have to have lost a function. Typically, the examples used for this are what are called pseudogenes that look like a gene but no longer code for anything. As far as we can tell, they don't make proteins. They aren't expressed. It's still often disagreed upon whether or not that makes them vestigial in every case, but this is very often the example you'll see. While we're mentioning confusing examples, I saw a paper that mentioned that evolution isn't the only thing that leaves behind vestiges. Development can leave behind vestiges. Our belly button is where the umbilical cord attached, and it is a scar left behind. We don't need a belly button.
Yes, there's a reason it's there.
Yes.
There was a function to that connection.
The umbilical cord was functional.
Yes. Now there's just a feature left over.
Now we just got a little lint pocket.
Yep.
For no reason. Sutures in bones. There's no reason you need to have lines on your skull. You have those because your skull used to be multiple bones that fused together. Those are technically vestiges, but not often described as vestigial structures.
They're not evolutionary vestiges.
Yes.
They're ontogenetic vestiges.
And so the paper said that we should save the term vestiges for evolutionary structures so as to avoid confusion.
We need a different word.
Yep. There are examples outside of animals, but they were much rarer and much less agreed upon, it seems. Like, plants were mentioned a few times, but A, it didn't seem like it was studied as much, and B, it seems like it may not be as agreed upon in all situations.
Sure.
There are reductions in plants that seem to have almost or nearly vestigial, like flowers that are pale and reduced. In certain flowers, there were noted structures that were vascular systems, so the things that flow around the juices that seem to lead to parts that are no longer there. but part of the plumbing is still there.
Yes.
So they have lost a part, but they still have some of the internal structure that used to go to that part.
Yes. Someone took out the air conditioner in this room,
Yeah.
but didn't get rid of the duct that
Yes.
used to lead to the... This is based on a true story.
Yep. Well, it's like when you go into an old house and there's just that gas main pipe sticking out of
Yes.
the wall in the basement. That
It's not doing anything anymore.
Not doing anything. So there are examples. I saw it also mentioned in organelles, mitochondria, and chloroplasts.
Oh, sure.
Have certain genetics and certain things that are no longer functioning back when they used to be a separate organism. And there are examples that come up with like objects.
Sure. like cultural,
Yes.
technological vestiges.
That will get used in this situation. And it's just an interesting concept because they made the point that it is a very similar process to evolution of we often design things practically. And they noted that there is a difference between a object vestige and skeuomorphism, which is something put there purposely to reference the old thing so that it's recognizable
Yes.
to people. See the save button on Word documents, which still shows a floppy disk.
Yes.
But they noted that like buttons on the sleeves of men's suits used to actually be able to unbutton and fold the suit sleeve back like we can with button shirts. But now we just have buttons on the sleeves. Mm-hmm. That kind of
It's just
idea.
tradition.
Yeah. There are so many more examples. If we wanted a 5-hour episode,
Send us your favorite examples of
please do.
vestigial structures.
this is one of those hard ones where like, man, there's so many that had to be skipped because and they all are so weird
Do you
and
have
unique.
any croc examples?
I didn't
Because we
come
talked
across
about it with snakes a bunch.
Yeah, I didn't come across any mention for them.
The only example that I can think of, and this is one of those maybe nebulous
Mm-hmm.
ones, we've talked about there is the hypothesis that crocs ancestrally were endothermic.
Yes.
That they were, quote, warm-blooded, and that that's part of the reason why their respiratory system is more like birds.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's true, then their advanced respiratory system might be a vestigial remnant of their endothermic ancestors.
Ooh, this is one that I'm literally thinking of right now. I didn't see this as an example, and I'm sure it would be highly debated by other croc researchers. Death rolling in certain species.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure.
Like, a dwarf caiman is not dismembering large prey items, which is the primary use of a death roll.
Yeah, is to tear off pieces.
It also is used defensively to get out of a grip. I'm going to roll and spin. But in certain species, like if gharials can death roll, that's a vestigial behavior, at least in part for feeding. Mm-hmm. It's still a defensive behavior, but it's lost its primary usage because you can't tear off food because your nose will snap.
Right.
That's
All right, interesting.
I would love to hear if there are any researchers out there. I would love to know.
If Dr. Tejas is listening,
Yes.
let us know.
I would love to know opinions.
Tell Will that he's wrong.
On whether or not small and slender snout croc death rolling is partially vestigial.
Fascinating.
So that's an overview of vestigiality in its diversity and how it's shaped some of our understanding of evolution.
Well, let's take a short break, and then after we get back, we'll talk about the evolution of vestigial structures and the paths that vestigiality can take. So I'm going to add one more to our list of vestigial vocabulary words. Vestigialization. The process by which a feature becomes vestigial.
Vestigializes.
It vestigializes. This is also often used either interchangeably or alongside the concept of regressive evolution.
Yes.
That is, something becoming reduced over time. Regressive evolution is a little bit of a misnomer because regressive makes it sound like it's going backwards.
Yes.
Which technically is not a thing that evolution does. A structure is now just evolving into vestigiality.
Yep.
It's not return. Technically, that's still progress. It's just progressing in a small direction.
Yep.
But reductive or regressive evolution is the process by which something reduces its functionality, reduces its size. This type of evolutionary process is extraordinarily common.
Yeah.
And this is one of those features, again, the way that we typically think about evolution with classic examples. I saw multiple papers talking about this that pointed out that vestigialization, the reduction of features, is probably an order of magnitude more common than the evolution of new features and new structures. Because every feature that exists is a potential foundation for reduction in the future.
Well, and it's a much easier process, and it can happen fast.
It sure can. Now, as far as how this happens and why it happens, this is a question we've talked about before. This came up in particular in episode 112 about caves and the way things evolve in caves. Very broadly speaking, to oversimplify this extremely complicated and oft-debated topic, there are two main forces, two main reasons why we might see a structure become reduced and vestigialized. One is what's often termed negative selection. That is, natural selection is working, as it does, towards reducing this feature. That for some reason or another, it's not just that this feature happens to be reduced, it is beneficial for it to be reduced, and therefore selective pressures are working at it to reduce it the same way that they might augment some other feature.
That organism would be worse off if it stays as is.
Yes. This sort of, quote, active selection is not really how natural selection works, but, there is a pressure forcing this feature to reduce. This probably is most likely in a case where that feature is getting in the way of some other structure.
Yes.
For example, we've talked about how sauropod dinosaurs, the long-necked dinosaurs, in many groups, the finger bones on the hands become smaller and in some cases absent completely. That very well could have been a selected, a beneficial feature because those finger bones were getting in the way.
Yes.
Of that is actually making it less efficient to walk on these hands. So those finger bones gradually disappearing is a selective benefit.
Yeah, they're more of a hassle than a help.
Yes. Something similar might very well be true with, say, the tails of apes.
Yep.
That at a certain point in ape evolution, their behavior changed to the point where this tail not only isn't helpful, it's getting in the way.
Yeah, we're not using it to balance anymore because we stood up or something. And now it's just a thing back there.
Yes.
That can get injured, that can get damaged, and all sorts of stuff.
If they cut it off, we can't turn into a giant monster anymore.
It's a hassle.
This is actually something that has also, I've seen suggested about theropod dinosaurs, so your T-Rex and such, as a hypothesized explanation for why their arms got so small.
Oh.
And I don't know how widespread this hypothesis has support, but I've seen it suggested that the reduction of the arms, and in particular the musculature needed to power those arms, might have made more room for musculature to power the head and the neck.
Yeah.
That if you've reached a point where your jaws are being used for the things that your arms are being used for, now those arm muscles are taking up valuable real estate.
Yes.
That could instead be being used to empower the head.
And that's a great example for, very often this is caused because something else is developing in some particular direction or new way. And that, to go down that path, you need to leave some things behind or get them out of the way.
The other pressure, the other sort of force, as it were, is what's called relaxed selection. And this is much more the explanation of it just kind of happened to become reduced.
Yes.
The logic here is that if a structure, say the tail, is no longer being used, even if there's not a problem with the tail being there, mutations can start to build up in that tail. If you're a spider monkey and you develop a weird mutation in the tail, that's a problem.
Yep.
Which means you're going to get what's called stabilizing selection. So any weird things that show up that get in the way of function, that individual's probably not going to survive or have as many babies, and so the tail is going to, as generations go by, retain its tail-like shape.
Yes.
But if you're an early, ape ancestor and you're not using the tail for anything, then mutations can build up and it kind of doesn't matter.
Yes. The like relatable example it makes me think of is when people maintenance their cars, most people's tires are in much more similar condition than the upholstery. It doesn't matter if the upholstery on my car gets damaged because that doesn't stop me from driving. My tires get damaged, I don't have a car.
Yes.
So that has to be maintained. I can throw a blanket over the seat. That can be adjusted. That can diverge.
This has been suggested and discussed quite a bit when it comes to the reduction of eyes.
Yes.
This is what we talked about in the caves episode. Cave species tend to lose their eyes. And part of the potential explanation for that is that if you're not using your eyes to see, it doesn't matter what happens to them.
Yeah.
So mutations can cause them to become smaller, or can cause cataracts to develop, or even skin to grow over the eyes. And it doesn't matter, so those sorts of things just gradually happen over time until the eye has taken on a reduced shape or reduced function, simply because there was no selective benefit to preventing that from happening.
In perpetual darkness, a healthy eye is just as useful as a mutated, as a damaged, or as a missing eye.
Yes. Cavefish, specifically Mexican cavefish, are one of the model organisms for vestigialization, and research on their eyes and other features has found support for both of these things.
Yeah.
That there is probably, in most cases, at least a little bit of just random mutations gradually accumulating and some selective benefit for those things to disappear. And they can go hand in hand,
Yeah.
right? If a random mutation, a bunch of random mutations happens to an eye over many generations, and then one of those mutations makes it more susceptible to getting infected,
Yep.
now there's going to be a selective benefit for getting rid of that eye.
Our wisdom teeth are a prime example of that. As our jaw shortened and we stopped eating as tough of food because we're now cooking it or processing it, we don't need as many molars, so our backmost molar just isn't important. In many people it doesn't erupt, they don't erupt or might not be there. But when they do erupt, they very often erupt wrongly.
Yes.
Because they haven't been maintained selectively. So if we were still under the pressures of natural selection, over time, those who were born without wisdom teeth would be doing better. And slowly but surely, we would lose that tooth altogether.
Vestigialization can also happen slowly or quickly. It can be something where, a tail or a limb is being reduced because one mutation after the other gradually makes it smaller or reduces certain bones. But you could also get a single mutation that just cuts off the developmental process of making that limb.
Yes.
So you can have gradual reduction, or you can have it happen in one or multiple fairly big steps. And again, this is something where research has seen evidence for both of these processes, often happening side by side.
Yes,
These
exactly.
don't have to be mutually exclusive.
Well, if you start reducing it and now mutations can happen, that just increases your chances of one of those kinds of mutations happening.
Yes. You can also get different patterns of vestigialization in similar structures. We mentioned this earlier with the way that different groups reduce their legs. To add to the legs example, I found one study that looked at tetrapods, so vertebrate limbs, and found that the patterns of reduction, the patterns of vestigialization in vertebrate legs tend to be different for the front legs and the hind legs.
Yeah.
That what bones are getting reduced, what features are getting reduced, the timing of it. The back legs tend to follow certain patterns and the front legs tend to follow certain different patterns.
Yeah.
That they're not doing the same thing. Another really fun example is teeth. Lots of animals have reduced their teeth, lost their teeth from ancestral toothed conditions, but how they go about doing it can vary. This is something that we learn often from the fossil record.
Mm-hmm.
In birds, for example, as we look across their fossil record, what seems to have happened is that early on, birds lost their front teeth and kept the back teeth for a while, and then eventually lost the back teeth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Turtles, on the other hand, lost the teeth around the edge of the mouth, but kept the teeth on the roof of the mouth, the palatal teeth, and then lost those later.
Yeah.
A 2023 study looked at reduction of teeth in xenarthran mammals, so these are your sloths and armadillos and stuff. This was not a fossil study, this was a genetic study, and found that you have dental genes, so the genes that code for the development of teeth, have been lost or reduced in different clades of Xenarthra, but different lineages within the group have lost different dental genes, which means that the reduction and vestigialization of teeth has happened convergently among these groups. In one case, they were even able to get a bit of the order of events. Pelosa is the group that includes sloths and anteaters. All across this group, they share the loss of genetic coding for enamel on the teeth.
Okay.
So the hard coating over the teeth. But in anteaters, who have that loss of enamel, they also don't grow teeth at all. So in anteater ancestry, what seems to have happened is they lost their enamel first and then lost the rest of the tooth. So you can get reduction and vestigialization of structures convergently in different ways.
Yes.
The same way that you can get new features evolving in different ways in different groups of animals. Now, one thing that I think is extremely interesting when talking about the evolution of vestigial structures is the paths that vestigialization can take.
Mm-hmm.
Once you get something that has evolved to a vestigial state, there are a bunch of different things that can then happen to it. One option is that it just continues in that direction and disappears forever.
Poof.
Right. That the teeth of birds, the legs of snakes, right? Reduced, and then it's gone. Another option is that, as is the case with basically all of the examples we talked about in the first half, is that the vestigial structures might stick around for a while.
Yep.
They might just be there. One incredible example of this that I'm thrilled you didn't mention in the first half, because this is super cool. I found a 2014 study that looked at various invertebrates that have evolved asexuality. In particular, in this case, they looked at crustaceans and insects and arachnids, at populations or species that had given up sexual reproduction and have become asexual. Asexual species are all female, and they don't mate. Mm-hmm. So they're not actually mating, they're reproducing parthenogenetically. In these populations, many of the females have lost some of their sexual traits that were important for courtship or for reproduction. Either they've lost them or they are vestigial. Mm-hmm. Some of them are still there. In many of these lineages, every now and then, one of them will give birth to a male.
Mm-hmm.
And not like technically it's a male, genetically, a fully functional male member of the species, which is fascinating because they're not reproducing, which means that the male is vestigial.
Yes.
You have a vestigial sex in this population. And this indicates, in order for this to happen, that means that the full genetic pathway for making a male of whatever species this is still there.
Yeah.
Those genes are still functional within the body. They're just not being activated for whatever reasons until some weird thing happens that turns that pathway on, and then just a whole male spider or whatever pops out.
Yeah.
So they're like the Gerudo. Like once every 100 years, a whole male shows up.
Keep your eye on that male.
Watch out. That male's bad news.
They tend to be troublemakers.
That's going to be a real problem. Now, this obviously raises the question of why is that still there? Because that's a lot of genetic conservancy, right? You have held on to a very complex series of features despite not using it anymore.
Yes.
And in this paper, they talked about how it could be that this is that process of relaxed selection we talked about, there's no benefit for getting rid of it, and it's just really slow to change.
Yes.
You have to wait for those mutations to build up. Or, similar to what you mentioned just a little while ago, it could be that those genetic pathways that are important for making a male are also important for making females.
Yes.
That if anything happens to those genetic pathways, it will be a mess for any individual of that species. So in order for them to continue developing properly, they have to keep all of the genetic systems that can make a male.
Yeah.
So it's there because it's important for it to be there, even though this manifestation of that genetic system is vestigial.
Yeah. I feel like that happens. I've heard of that happening with computer programs where we develop a computer program off of, or like a video game or something, off of this other pre-existing one, and we've changed it. So now we've left behind some of the features of the old program, but deep in the code of Halo, there's still all of these things that technically this system can do.
Yes.
Because to delete those would mean we'd have to reprogram it basically from scratch. So it's just easier to leave in the calculator feature that's not going to be displayed or accessible or ever mentioned.
But if we get rid of it, we have to reinvent the calculator.
Yep.
In order for the game to work.
Yes, exactly. Like we have to fill in the gap that will leave. So it's just better to hide it. And then you'll get those people that go, Luigi was in it the whole time.
Yes. I saw a meme, I think, online that was something to the effect of, like, you'll be playing a game and, like, some hacker will discover a chair hidden in a room you can't get to.
Yes.
And they're like, we found this chair. And the devs are like, yeah, the chair doesn't do anything, but if we remove it, the game breaks. So we left the chair there.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting concept. It really emphasizes the complexity, especially of genetics, to where it's like, why do you need to be able to make males to also then breathe? I don't know, but those genes are neighbors, and if you remove one, the other one gets angry.
So, in order for the species to survive, once every 100 years, a male is born.
Yep.
And we just have to put up with what happens next. Another thing that can happen with vestigial structures is that they can become vestigial and then become something new.
Yeah.
We did a whole episode 78, about exaptation. That is the repurposing of a feature. So one of the famous examples, and one that we've talked about a lot, is feathers.
Yes.
Feathers did not evolve in flying animals. They evolved most likely for functions like thermoregulation or display. And then once they had evolved into feather shapes, they then became useful for flight. And then their evolutionary trajectory changed course.
Yeah.
And started becoming specialized for flight. This is exaptation. Vestigial structures are an excellent foundation for exaptation because they're not doing major functions anymore.
Yep.
Which means you can do whatever you want to it. And so you get all this variation, right? This came up, I think this was in bonus news, that the arm bones of emus tend to be very variable in their shape and in their anatomy because they're not doing anything anymore. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if there's variability.
Typically, the left and right aren't shaped the same because they aren't doing anything anyway. So it doesn't matter if they're shaped the same.
Which makes it that much more likely that they're going to randomly hit upon some structure that ends up having some alternative use.
Yeah, any job they can do now isn't going to get in the way of another job because they weren't doing anything.
Yes. One of the most famous examples of this is our ear bones.
Yeah.
In ancestral, our ancient ancestors had many bones in the lower jaw, and as mammals evolved, the bones in the back of the jaw became smaller and smaller and smaller because they weren't using them anymore. But instead of disappearing completely, 3 of those bones were repurposed into what are now our inner ear bones.
Yeah.
These were vestigial jaw bones that then got repurposed to be part of the inner ear. We talked about that a bunch in episode 178 about ears. Another really cool example is actually from plants. So this is for Allie. Plants often, specifically flowering plants, often have vestigial structures called staminodes. So in the flower, the male organ of a flower is called the stamen. The stamen is what produces pollen. So they makes pollen. That's when a bee picks up pollen, it's picking it up from the stamen. Staminodes are non-functional stamens. So it's a stamen that doesn't produce pollen anymore. It's vestigial. It's pretty common in flower evolution for the number of stamens to become reduced over time.
Yes.
So you end up with staminodes. Right? Ancestrally, we had 8 stamens. Now we have 4 stamens and 1 staminode that just didn't disappear completely. Staminodes don't produce pollen, and they're often not shaped correctly. They'll be like lying down, or they'll be in an unusual shape. That means they can't do anything that a stamen is supposed to do. So they are vestigial. They tend to vary quite a lot in their shape, and in many species, they are apparently functionless.
Yeah.
They're just there. They are vestigial parts of a flower. But in many species, the staminodes have since evolved new functions. In some flowers, the staminodes have evolved into the shape of effectively a barrier to block access from some herbivores who are trying to access nectar. Some staminodes form barriers between the male and female parts of the flower so that it can't self-fertilize.
Yeah.
Some are colorful to attract pollinators. Some even produce nectar or other foods to attract pollinators. Ancestrally, they were stamens, became vestigial, and then, now that they aren't important for stamening anymore, have diverted function to something new.
Which really drives home that confusing way to dissect the definition of you lost your main function and you still don't have it. So
Yes.
ergo, by that definition, this is still a vestigial structure.
Yes, our inner ear bones are technically still a vestigial structure.
Yeah.
Even though they are doing an incredibly important function right now.
It also can get tricky when trying to determine whether the functions the thing has are remnant functions or some new function. So are the attachments for our tailbone the way it was attached beforehand, or new attachments that have formed now that we're not using it?
Well, in the ears episode, we talked about the fact that those jaw bones in our ancestors probably did have a sensory function.
Yeah.
Because they have that in lizards and stuff today. So it's not that the ear function was a completely new feature, but that it switched that functioning. It gave up being part of the jaw and then became extra specialized for hearing.
Yes.
One more fascinating avenue that vestigial structures can take is that in some conditions, a vestigial structure can come back. This is called atavism. Atavism refers to a feature that was lost and then returned. So lost or reduced and then comes back. A really cool example of this that I was not familiar with is in stick insects. Stick insects are the whole family, phasmids, ancestrally do not have wings.
Yup.
The ancestors of stick insects do not have wings. All the lineages of stick insects are wingless lineages ancestrally. Several groups of stick insects have re-evolved wings.
That's not allowed.
And you can see that they've re-evolved it because there'll be a lineage where all of their cousins are wingless.
Yeah.
The ancestral state for this lineage is winglessness, but they have wings. They did not evolve a new type of wing.
Yeah.
It's just phasmid wings, which, similar to those vestigial males from earlier, suggests that for one reason or another, they saved the genetic pathway for making wings. It had been turned off, and then in these lineages, for one reason or another, the wings are turned back on.
Which is crazy because it's like, it seems like for such a complex feature, how have you kept all the coding
Yes.
to just turn flight back on?
And it's very much like those vestigial males.
Yeah.
And indeed, within a group of mites called oribatid mites, these mites are typically asexual, parthenogenic, just like what we were talking about before. One family of these mites, Crotoniidae, has re-evolved sexual reproduction.
Ha!
Very likely because the genetics for making males were conserved, and then whatever conditions came about meant that those males started to become useful again.
Yes.
So that vestigial structure regained a purpose and now is a sexually reproducing species again.
Cool.
Atavism is, importantly, different from convergent evolution. This is a really important one to discuss. One of the classic examples of this are the teeth, quote unquote, in birds like geese.
Yes.
If you look up pictures of, if you Google geese teeth, you will find pictures of geese with their mouths open and the horrifying image of just these like serrations around the tongue inside the mouth. These are not teeth. They are soft tissue structures that have evolved a tooth-like shape. Geese still have genes to make teeth. They're turned off, and that is different from these tooth-like structures.
Yeah.
Same thing with the extinct pseudo-toothed birds, the pelagornithids. Those are bony projections off the beak that are different from teeth that evolved separately. And atavism happens when a genetic system is effectively turned off and then later on in the generations turned back on again.
Yeah.
This can be something where it is completely turned off and it's just in there not doing anything, and then some mutation turns it back on. Atavisms can also happen because of developmental changes. You mentioned way earlier in the episode that in whales, for example, in toothed whales, they start developing limbs.
Yes.
And then it reverses, or in those lizards where they develop the leg, but then it doesn't finish developing. It is possible that that development could go back to being more complete.
Yeah, absolutely.
Humans, we don't have tails, but our embryos start to develop a tail. If some mutation happened that tail was retained into after we're born and even into adulthood, that would be the return of the tail, even though it never actually fully disappeared.
Yes.
But it disappeared to the point where we never saw it anymore because it was only happening in utero. So you can shift the development of a feature that can also lead to an atavistic reemergence of a trait.
Yeah. It's such a cool concept.
Vestigial structures can do this was my favorite part of going through, the evolution of vestigial structures. I think that the evolution of how things become vestigial is really interesting. I think it is even more interesting the question of then what happens.
Yes.
Because now it's just a feature that you can kind of do anything with.
Yep.
Because it's not tied to a specific important function anymore.
Well, and atavism is also one of those odd scenarios where that feels like it shouldn't work that way. Because 9 times out of 10 when we're asked the question of, so will snakes ever re-evolve legs? Probably not.
Right. And in the case of snakes, probably not, because their genetic pathway for making legs isn't there anymore.
Yes, they have lost legs so completely and entirely that even the genes are no longer represented.
And even in a group like, famously there have been experiments that have managed to induce the development of teeth in chicken embryos.
Yes.
Because they do still have at least enough of the genetic pathway for teeth to turn it back on. But that is something we have only seen happen, to my knowledge, in lab experiments.
Exactly.
I don't think we have any examples of that happening naturally in a wild population of birds. That's something we did, but that's something, there might be some reason that evolutionarily that couldn't happen.
Yeah, but it's got that feeling of like evolution is happening on such a large scale with so many species and so many individuals and so many populations that every now and then you do get these scenarios that when typically asked, we would tell you, no, that's not how evolution works, except for those rare and specific instances where, kind of it does.
Yep.
You can kind of just turn it back on sometimes.
I also actually saw some discussion in one of the papers I read about those crickets that lost their song but retained the rubbing behavior. That in some populations, it looks like they might be re-evolving song because they're still rubbing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that occasionally that's going to mean you make noise, and some groups might be redeveloping songs.
Yes.
Because they still have that vestigial behavior.
Well, as soon as it's not a detriment to be noisy or, beneficial to be silent, there's no reason that you can't start being noisy again. And That's super beneficial. That's why it evolves in so many groups. Mating
Yes.
calls are super common.
And that's a case where it is very difficult to draw the line between how much is this atavistic
Yep.
and how much is this convergent.
Yes. And that one's great because the various ones that have lost it, their wing shapes are all changed in different ways.
Yep.
There's flattened ones, there's reduced ones. I think one was like coil. I can't remember. But like their wing shapes have changed in different ways to stop the noise making. So you could have one group that atavistically regains its noise making, and then another one that exapts those wings into a new thing, and another one that develops a new way to make sound. All different evolutionary scenarios.
Yes. Well, and you could also have where the behavior is vestigial, but the song producing structures are a new development.
Exactly.
So, this is like we talked about a whole bunch in the first part of the discussion. This is one of those topics that at the surface level is very simple and easy to understand. Once you start digging into it, it becomes extremely complicated and endlessly fascinating.
Well, it is, as is so often the case with biological discussions, each vestigial structure is really its own unique scenario.
Yeah, we're not really talking about a type of thing.
Yeah.
We're talking about a fundamental part of evolutionary process.
Yes. There was a quote from Darwin that says that it is impossible to look at any higher organism without finding a litany or a list of vestigial structures.
Yep.
And even within us, the reason our appendix is vestigial is not the same reason our ear muscles are vestigial, is not the same reason our the plica semilunaris, the thing next to our tear duct, that's that little bloop, is the remnant of our nictitating membrane in other mammals, but also like still helps with cleaning the eye.
Yes.
The reason the different parts of us that are no longer doing the job they used to do are all very different structures, vestigial for probably very different reasons, and probably became vestigial in very different ways, and are also different levels, quote unquote. That's not really a way to, but different
degrees of vestigial.
Yeah, different situations. Like it's debated whether or not human hair it could be considered vestigial because it's not clear whether or not it serves a survival function, but obviously it has secondary functions because it's one of the key ways that humans self-identify and communicate and display. Each single example of vestigiality is its own textbook of conversation into this evolutionary topic.
Yes. Dear listeners, if we did not mention your favorite example of a vestigial structure, let us know. You can send us an email or you can join the Discord and chat with the rest of our community members about everyone's favorite vestigial structures.
There are a number that I had to skip over just to save time that were great. We didn't even talk about male nipples.
Nope.
It's
I have
lots
a
of good
book
topics.
somewhere that is the title of the book is Why Do Men Have Nipples?
Yes. It's good stuff. Before we wrap up the episode, one last section, our patron question. Every episode, we like to answer one of the questions from our patrons, which at certain levels, you can submit questions for us to answer here on the podcast. David, what's our question?
This episode, our patron question comes from Philippe, who asks, when did amphibians lose their fifth hand digits? Is it possible that 4 fingers is the ancestral condition from their tetrapod ancestors? And if so, could amphibians be a separate lineage all along from the rest of tetrapods?
This is a great question. I felt very fitting for
Yes,
this discussion.
Because digits are one of the most commonly vestigialized features on tetrapods.
Yes, animals are losing digits all over the place. Famously, early tetrapods, so some of the first land vertebrates that came out of the water and evolved from our lobe fin-fished ancestors, had more than 5 digits on their hands and feet. What we often will put out as the default number of digits is 5 fingers, 5 toes.
Right, because that across true tetrapod, leaving out the early weird early experiments, 5 is the maximum that we see, and anything with less than that has gone down from 5.
Yes, but early members were polyadactyl. They had more than 5.
Yes. Like Ichthyostega, I think, had 8 digits on each hand, or 7.
Oh, I have that one. Oh, I have
Acanthostega.
Acanthostega, which had 8 on both of the hind limbs and forelimbs. Mm-hmm. And Ichthyostega had 7 digits on the hind limbs, and evidently the hands are unknown.
Okay, sure.
On that one. Over time, we see these lineages reduce their digits down to eventually the pentadactyl, the 5-digited hands and feet. What Philippe is referring to is that amphibians famously are missing one of their hand digits, so they only have 4, while I believe in many still retaining 5 on the back.
Okay.
If I think I remember reading that, but I'd have to double check.
I'm picturing a frog's legs, and I think that it has 5 digits.
And so they, as a group in general, have 4-fingered hands. When they lost that would very much determine the ancestral condition that they do or don't share with the rest of tetrapods, the amniote side of things, reptiles and eventually mammals and all of us. Based off of my quick research, in the Devonian, many of these lineages of early tetrapods had many digits. It's evidently unclear whether those survived into the Carboniferous at all.
Yeah, as far as I know, I recently did an episode of SciShow about Romer's Gap, so I read about this.
Perfect.
As far as I know, Carboniferous tetrapods across the board have 5 fingers.
Yes.
Or fewer eventually when they start to reduce them.
Exactly. So early Carboniferous, it seems we are down to the 5-digit plan. And then in Temnospondyles, we see the reduction down to the 4 up front, which then seems to continue with amphibians.
Yeah, because our modern amphibians are descended from temnospondyle ancestors.
Yes.
And also don't arise until sometime well after those first Carboniferous 5-fingered tetrapods.
Yes, so, and that seems to have happened by like the mid-Carboniferous, from what I could tell.
Okay.
I couldn't find like a date for when we think that was lost, but it was a quick search, so that might be out there. It evidently was once thought that the reduced digits we see in amphibians and reptiles happened independently.
Okay.
And that it was a separate situation for both of them. But evidently the more recent research and more current understanding is that this is ancestral to stem tetrapods. That the 5 fingers is ancestral to our diversity of tetrapods now. And the amphibian loss was a thing that happened after that.
Okay. It also isn't unusual for a group of animals to, as we were talking about before, reduce their arms and legs differently.
Yes.
I think rhinos, if I remember correctly, modern rhinos, certainly tapirs. Tapirs definitely have a different number of fingers and toes.
Yes, absolutely.
We don't. That seems odd to us because generally speaking, humans develop 5 fingers and 5 toes, but there are lots of animals where that's not the case.
My favorite example, unsurprisingly, crocodilians. 5 fingers up front, 4 toes in the back. 2 of the toes are unclawed.
Oh yeah,
the
like
outer
a
2
sauropod.
toes don't have a claw on the outside, so the front hand has 3 claws and 2 just little chicken finger looking things, and on the back it's 2 and 2.
Speaking of archosaurs, T-Rex is another example.
Yeah.
2 fingers, 4 toes, 3 functional toes.
Yes. I think I have the claws right on the back. They might be 3 claws on both, but they have a reduction and a reduction in the features.
Yes.
Going from the outside in. They also mentioned that even in some late Devonian members of this group, of the stem tetrapod groups, functionally probably had 5 toes, even though it seems like one or some of the toes were made up of multiple elements for toes, but functionally they were grouped in a way that probably acted like a 5-toed foot and hand.
Right.
So even before the Carboniferous, we were probably already effectively a 5-toed situation.
Yeah.
Even though we hadn't lost all the pieces yet.
Now, why 5? Who can say?
No, yeah. Who knows?
That it could be that was the best option. It could be that that's just the option that happened.
Yeah, the lineage that became successful was one of those, and that stuck around. It could be one of those situations where genetically that is linked to a bunch of other stuff. That just means that typically, unless you're doing something weird with your hands and feet, like a horse, 5 is just going to stick around. There's no reason to adjust it.
Much like teeth, in mammals, for example, there is an ancestral number of teeth.
Yes.
That all modern mammals have either, for the most part, either retained that number or reduced it. Fingers and toes have worked very much the same way. Ancestral tetrapods had 5, and all living tetrapods today either still have 5 or have reduced them to some degree, or in some cases entirely. We don't have examples of more digits re-evolving, except go listen to episode 116.
I did find an example of talking about vestigial finger bones in whales, which was one of those where I went, oh yeah, I guess, because you're still using them, but some of them you're not using as much as the others.
Yeah.
So in that paddle, some of those finger bones are more vestigial than others.
Yeah.
Which is a weird, because you don't have fingers anymore.
Well, and the ichthyosaurs, who I was
Yeah.
just referring to, kind of evolved more fingers.
Yeah.
But they're not using them as
they're not
fingers.
Fingers. If you submitted that to me when I asked you for examples of fingers, I'd kick you out.
Yes, you would be wrong. Also, in before everybody brings up pandas to me.
Yes.
Technically not a finger.
Yes.
That's a I think it's a sesamoid.
Yeah, it's a sesamoid.
It's a sesamoid. But yes, you are not wrong to bring it up.
Yep. But man, boy, if they survive in a bajillion years, it'll be a fun thing for educators to go, you see this finger that's absolutely fully dexterous and able to do everything? Not a finger.
Not a finger.
Let's talk about why there are these six-fingered animals have taken over the world.
You killed my father.
This is how they took over the world.
Yes.
Listeners, hope you enjoyed our exploration of the useless things. As we said, there are so many examples we couldn't cover. If you want to see images and see some of the examples and sources and dive a bit deeper, you can check out the blog post. The link is in the description. Remember that we are nearing the end of the year, so our Q&A will be coming out soon. Thanks again to everyone who requested this topic. Welcome again to all of our new patrons. Thank you to all of our old patrons. Extra special thanks to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Daniel the Bug Lover, Robert Marked, and Melissa Barksdale. And with that, we can wrap up.
We release episodes every fortnight.
Each one of them.
Every episode. The whole episode I've been trying to think of an example of something that's vestigial about the podcast.
Is that announcement?
I had that thought. Is the announcement of every fortnight, but that's still functional. It tells people if this is your first time. For new people,
but yeah.
I'll tell you what was vestigial for a while, the Common Descent Twitter account.
Oh yeah, no,
that was
absolutely.
up there. We stopped using it for a while when because Twitter became terrible. But it did exist for a while.
Yes, it did. Here's the behind the scenes for everyone that might be vestigial. When I edit the audio, there's a bunch of steps I do that I don't actually know that I still need to do them.
Behavior.
Yeah, that I ran them because they were suggested back when I didn't know what I was doing.
Sure.
Now I'm a bit more confident, but it's pre-programmed, and I don't want to change the programming. And
because if you take out that chair, the game breaks.
Yeah, I don't want to do the testing that needs to be done to confirm whether or not I need to do the loudness feature. So I still do it. No, and also Audacity is updated like a dozen times.
Sure.
So who knows if any of those still work the same. So yeah, who knows? There might be a whole bunch of vestigial features in how we edit.
Listeners, let us know what vestigial things you do.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.